Hi, everybody, and a warm welcome to our session Optimizing Healthcare. Researchers and industrial will come and share their discovery and innovation in this field. I am Barbara Decel, the Health Research Advisor at IVADO, and I will moderate this session with my colleague Vanessa Alary. We have an exciting program this afternoon, but before to start, I'd like to share a few housekeeping considerations. Each presentation lasts 20 minutes and is followed by a question period of 5 minutes. Time is precious today, as our schedule is very tight. Vanessa and I will be the timekeepers in order to respect your time. Concerning the question and answer period, I would like to remind you that there is no audio interaction on the platform. You can ask your question in the question tab on the right side of the screen between chat and poll tab. We will moderate them at the end. Also, I encourage you to vote for the questions that most appeal to you, as I will prioritize the questions with the most votes. Finally, the presentations are recorded. You will have access to them after completing the satisfaction survey that you will receive by email at the end of the day. And it is now with great pleasure that I introduce Robert Fratilla, co-founder and VP of Aifred, that will present How Will AI Revolutionize Mental Health Care? Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you for inviting me to present at this wonderful event. It's a pleasure to get to spread the word on some of the exciting challenges that we're facing in mental health care. So with that, I come to represent and am proud to bring together a diverse international team of healthcare leaders, clinicians, neuroscientists, computer scientists, and researchers to tackle global challenges in the field of mental health. We placed #1 in North America and #2 in the world for the global IBM Watson AI X Prize. In relatively recent years, we've observed a so-called crisis in psychiatry. The pharmaceutical industry has failed to develop effective treatments for most neuropsychiatric indications, in particular mood disorders and depression. Today, we are still relying on semi-effective drugs that were developed many decades ago. Drug discovery efforts have been unable to yield better than existing treatments on the market. In fact, in recent years, many big pharma companies have either heavily reduced or shut down entirely their psychiatric research divisions and budgets. But now, it is more crucial than ever to invest in brain health. Previously published data from the 2018 Canadian Community Health Survey found that 8% of Canadians reported fair or poor mental health. Over half of participants report that their mental health has worsened since the onset of physical distancing due to COVID-19. A first-of-its-kind study from the Boston University School of Public Health finds 27.8% of US adults had depression symptoms as of mid-April 2020, compared to only 8.5% before the pandemic even started. I'll speak about depression as it's our main focus at Aifred Health. The rates of cognitive and aging-associated diseases are only rising. Depression has become the leading source of disability burden in the world. Out of any medical condition, 1 in 9 will suffer in their lifetime. The proportion of the global population living with depression is estimated to be 322 million people, 4.4% of the world's population, according to a new report, Depression and Other Common Mental Disorders, Global Health Estimates, released by the WHO. There is a significant socioeconomic burden, costing over $125 billion in direct healthcare costs per year in the US alone, and $90 billion in indirect healthcare costs. Perhaps what is most alarming is that only 67% do not respond to their first course of treatments. We observe what is essentially a trial and error approach to selecting treatments, even at the level of psychiatric specialists. This is because we don't actually know which treatment is going to work for who. A large underlying reason is because we still don't actually understand the complex makeup of most mental health disorders. So why is it so difficult to treat? One possible explanation is that incredibly diverse neurobiological and environmental factors are contributing to the clinical presentation of these disorders. These factors vary between individuals, and for each patient, we don't know which of these factors are contributing most. And in fact, traditional statistics might not be able to adequately capture all of this patient heterogeneity. And here is a big reason why we see these methods failing. So let's take a step back and consider the basic scientific method. First one makes an observation, you form a question, etc. However, when it comes to large existing big data in medicine, the order in which the scientific method is conducted has changed. We are no longer hypothesizing before designing our experiment and collecting the data, because the data oftentimes is already there and in full form. Instead, the challenge of designing an appropriate experiment to collect the right data set, the most important features, has shifted to the challenge of extracting the most telling features in a sea of noise, the rest of the data set. So how do we do this? How are we going to capture the heterogeneity in patients? We at Aifred Health think the answer is within deep learning. Deep learning is a type of machine learning used within artificial intelligence. Artificial neural networks were originally modeled after the primary visual cortex in the central nervous system, wherein we have several layers of neurons that are interconnected. These nodes capture relationships and patterns within the inputs, creates some representation, and then makes certain classifications as defined in the output layer. Deep learning is neural networks on steroids. There are multiple layers that are fully connected and which create increasingly abstract representations of our inputs. Deep learning is very effective at solving complex problems. Most popular applications are in real-time translation, self-driving cars, and image recognition, just to name a few. However, that's not to say that it will be a breeze to just get the perfect model from the get-go. It might be a little bit harder than you think. Try to predict if the image contains a labradoodle or a picture of fried chicken. You may have, for a split second, thought it was all pictures of the same thing, but your intelligent brain was able to pick apart the nuances of each sample and make the best determination. Okay, so I think you've been staring at this for far too long. So to drive this point home, let's test you again. Is it a chihuahua or a blueberry muffin? It's sometimes trickier than it may seem. While this is a gross oversimplification of some of the challenges in building a model that generalizes well, there are other certain things to consider when applying these methods to psychiatry. So why do we think deep learning would work well for psychiatry? First, deep neural networks are very flexible and work well with sparse and high-dimensional multi-modality data types. This is particularly useful in psychiatry, where we have to pool many data sets together in order to have sufficient sample sizes, and which often have a lot of missing data in certain variables. Also in pharmacogenetics, where tons and tons of polymorphisms and variants are often implicated. Because you can define the number of hidden layers you want in your model, this is where the deep comes from. Deep learning is able to capture increasingly complex and abstract representations of your data. This is relevant because, again, psychiatric indications have incredibly diverse neurobiological underpinnings. And finally, perhaps the most important, is that deep learning can elucidate the features in the data set that have the most salience in terms of your model's predictions. Traditional machine learning methods require arduous manual feature engineering. And by that, we mean you have to define which features you want to go into your model. In deep learning, you feed your model everything, and feature extraction and classification happen in one shot. The model itself will tell you which features are most relevant. The feature extraction process is automated. This is particularly useful for us because we don't actually know which features are most relevant in predicting psychiatric responses to treatments. Several years ago, our research group conducted the largest systematic meta-review of significant predictors of antidepressant treatment response. We screened thousands of reviews and included about 200. There were 6 groups in which these possible predictors of response could be classified: demographic, symptom profile, comorbidities, peripheral markers, genetic, and neuroimaging-based predictors. We identified an astounding 221 predictors of antidepressant treatment response. Now, obviously, it is unrealistic to ask doctors to have their psychiatric patients undergo all types of peripheral marker and genetic assays and neuroimaging scans. It's likely that many of these features are redundant, and a model that uses significantly less features to predict antidepressant treatment response may be able to do just as well. So we need to use deep learning to extract the most relevant features. So how do we do that? The machine learning team at Aifred Health has developed an open and modular deep learning framework. You can find it at a link provided above if you're curious. Its core functionality pillars are the ability to easily characterize your data, to rapidly prototype modular networks in order to best optimize its performance, and post hoc model interpretability methods to better understand why your deep learning AI model made the decisions that it did. What's most exciting is that we're also automating the data pre-processing and feature engineering pipelines, which traditionally is the most consuming and hardest part of doing machine learning. So I would like to walk you through some of the technical procedures that we follow to evaluate our models in a test environment to get a sense of how well it would perform in the real world. We do that via 2 separate analyses. I'll walk you through briefly through each one of them. The first is what we call the naive differential analysis. The following procedure loop, we go through it 5 times, and the average results are produced. Essentially what we do is, using our data, we take a single patient, we run it through the neural network 4 times each time with a separate drug. We identify the probability of remission for each of those drugs. We select the drug with the highest probability of remission, and we continue to do so for each of the 200 subjects that we've identified. Once we have each drug with the highest probability of remission for all 200 subjects, we take the average probability and we conduct that across the entire validation set to get a sense of what is the average increase in probability of remission. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what if a patient gets assigned a drug that we don't actually know the outcome of, that wasn't collected as part of the study? Well, that's a great question, because the following analysis is designed to help counter some of those biases. This conservative differential analysis is very similar to the original analysis, except we remove a lot of those hypothetical cases. So we first build out a randomly sampled set of data using bootstrap sampling with replacements. And if you're familiar with k-fold cross-validation, we essentially split the data into a variety of different buckets. Each of those buckets represents the validation set for that iteration of testing. We pull subjects individually from the test set, and we loop through assigning each of those possible drug variants to get the probability of remission. If the drug with the highest probability of remission was the drug that they actually received in the study, then we keep the subject within the data set. Otherwise, we remove it so that we don't account for those hypothetical cases. And from there, once we conduct that analysis, we can understand the full set of essentially a lower bound on the average probability of remission that we can expect. So with these two analyses together, you can envision a lower bound and upper bound for the average probability of remission that we expect when we go into something like a clinical trial. So this is all great, but how do we get this into the hands of physicians and patients? The current patient and physician clinical decision support tool is accessible on any device, supporting both telehealth and in-person appointments. A patient enters behavioral health information, which is then processed by the clinical algorithm based on best evidence guidelines. The output helps the physician understand where the patient is on the disease cycle, monitor the patient over time, and determine what to do next at each stage. For example, adding a psychotherapy or making adjustments to medication. Our tool is being used by physicians right now to significantly improve quality of care and outcomes for their patients during the pandemic. Upon regulatory approval, Aifred will combine its current clinical decision support tool with its AI model for treatment selection to create an end-to-end solution for treatment of depression unique in the field of mental health today. Let me give you a peek under the hood. The reason why these results are so exciting is because we're able to use deep learning to build a clinical decision support system to solve the trial and error approach to selecting treatments in psychiatry. Instead, we build models that are able to predict the optimal treatment for each individual patient, given their clinical symptom and biological markers. This is the work we're doing at Aifred Health. I would just like to share with you some of our ambitions. So with our clinical algorithm, we are hoping to achieve up to 50% reduction in the time that it takes for a patient to reach remission. And once the artificial intelligence agent is ready and approved through regulatory means, we're hoping to reach up to 48% in relative improvements in the rates of remission. And with that, I would like to thank everyone so much for your attention and keep following Aifred for all of the great things that we are looking to achieve in the future. If you have any further questions, I think we'll be taking those now. And here's my email if you ever want to reach out. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Robert, for this very insightful presentation. So one question for you. So you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you have been capable to identify 221 factors that could be used as indicators of mental health, if I'm correct. So among them, were they all previously described in literature, or have you been able to identify some new markers that could be then used by clinicians?
So that's a great question. That was a meta review of thousands of different review papers to try to identify what is the current industry leading response indicators that is being used in the world today for the treatment of depression or any mental health issues. What we're trying to do is use that as a foundation for the types of features that we're looking for when we're building an artificial intelligence model on top of that. In essence, what we would like to do is take those 221 possible predictors and try to collect as much data from study data and piece it together so that the model can then select from those predictors what it believes is the most useful in making that prediction of whether or not a patient given the drug will reach remission or not. I hope that answers.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. So now a question from Noor Diab. What kind of data are collected from the patient mobile application to help predict best treatment?
So right now we are meeting patients and physicians where they are, which is to say a lot of demographic, sociodemographic data is being collected about a patient. So for example, the patient health questionnaire. The PHQ-9 is one of the most popular surveys and questionnaires that is used by physicians today. I mentioned earlier that we also are looking at imaging and genetic markers, but those are becoming very tricky to require that of physicians for everyday in their everyday actions. And so that's why we're primarily using questionnaire data to build these model off of, so that we can simply introduce a new tool without having to ask for additional information from them.
Great. So to keep going on the data that you collect, so have you thought about collecting like data from the environment of the patient? Like, do you think it has an effect on the mental health of the patient? And do you think it could be relevant to collect this kind of data?
100%. That's a place that we're aspiring to get to. Unfortunately, just the data that is available isn't there yet. Being able to collect as much data as we would like can sometimes be a little bit intrusive. A lot of the study data that we're basing a lot of our models off of have not collected that sort of data. So we're hoping to expand upon that in the future to areas that include a lot more peripheral information about a patient and their situation and the place that they grow up or how they live their life every day, as that can show tremendous value. And that's why this is meant to be used as a tool for a physician, so that they can still interact with the patient and still get to some of those points that we would be missing from a model. Something that the physician can address.
Great, thanks. So maybe another question. So we can see that you use a lot of data coming maybe from different sources to train your algorithm. Is it a challenge?
Saying that it's a challenge is an understatement. Definitely one of the largest difficulties that we've had is trying to consolidate a clear view of all of the study data that is available on antidepressant treatment options. So various pharmaceutical companies or other research bodies will conduct studies on various drugs and collect data on those studies to see whether or not the drug is working well. However, not everyone collects the exact same collect the exact same amount of information and not necessarily the exact same structure. So trying to find ways of piecing together the story across studies from different origins to try to make sense of that and be able to leverage that data is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing to enable an AI model to be built to begin with.
Thanks. And now a question from Sarah Tanir. Can depression be detected via sensors or cameras in the city? Maybe urban planning perspective.
That's a great question. It's not something that we specialize in. We're focusing on patients that have been clinically diagnosed with depression. So we're more on the treatment assignment versus the diagnostics of identifying if someone is starting to suffer from depression. But sorry, I could give you a better answer.
It's great. So if we have no additional question, Robert, I really would like to thank you for your very interesting presentation. Thanks also to the audience for the questions. And I will let you go and take a 1 minute break until the next session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate your attention. I hope you learned something new today, and take care. Stay safe.